The museum's glass atrium glittered like something out of a sci-fi movie, but I wasn't living in that timeline. My clock didn't tick in hours, it measured miles traveled and loyalty broken. I'm Lila Brooks, former Air Force intel analyst, currently residing above a South Philly laundromat, where the hum of rinse cycles replaced the roar of jet engines. Every Sunday, I visit my foster mother in her nursing home. That's the only routine I cling to. The rest of my life? Still packed in a duffel by the door, ready to run, old habits die hard. Across the room, Julian Vale raised a champagne glass like a man who believed he owned the room. Tech mogul, former small-town debate rival, now standing under curated lighting, throwing polished shade in my direction like it was performance art. His toast? A bullet disguised as a compliment. A public rewrite of my story. They called me Soldier Girl. They laughed. They thought they were being cute. They weren't. To them, my service was a quirky side note. Something to pat on the head, then erase. But here's the thing about silence, it's not weakness. It's reconnaissance. Words are ammo. And I've been counting rounds. Julian thought he was the star. But he was just performing theft, stealing credit from Dr. Miriam Sato, the brilliant hydrologist who mentored me and now lives in a memory care unit. She gave me a brass whistle. I carry it still. She never had to yell. Her silence had precision, power. And now, this isn't just about pride. It's about legacy. Her legacy. Mine. Yours. I scanned the room. The polished faces. The fake allies. The donation-sized loyalties. The cameras. Every angle was being recorded except the truth. They erased my name. But I'm still here. Before we go any further, I want to know where you're hearing this from. Drop it in the comments. Because pain and purpose, they sound the same in every language. That night, standing in the cold air of the Philadelphia Museum of Art, with the distant city lights a smear of gold and white against the dark, my mind traveled back. Back to a different life, a quieter one, long before the public stage became a battlefield. I was a different person then, though I didn't know it. I was the person people looked past, not through. The person who always seemed to be standing just outside the frame. The pattern started subtly, a low flicker I chose to ignore. It began with the little things, the daily routines that felt so solid and real, a contrast to the coming fracture. I remember the mornings, back when I lived in a small row house in the Fishtown neighborhood, the sound of the L train a rhythmic beat in the distance. I'd have my black coffee and review my notes, the smell of roasted beans and damp autumn air from an open window grounding me. My life was defined by precision and purpose. I wasn't a CEO or a public face, but I knew my value. I was a strategist, an analyst, a problem solver. I worked behind the scenes, connecting the dots that others couldn't even see. This was my sanctuary, a place where competence mattered more than charisma. My first interaction with Julian had been in our college debate club, a world of structured arguments and timed rebuttals. He was all polished charm and brittle wit, a performer from the start. I was the one who did the research, who found the obscure data, who wrote the cutting-edge arguments that won us our tournaments. He was the one who delivered them, his voice a smooth instrument. We were a good team, in a way. He was the spotlight, I was the power source. He would flash his charming smile and tell people, Lila finds the facts. I just make them sound beautiful. It was a line that always got a laugh, and I, in my naive way, found it endearing. It wasn't a lie, after all. But it was a dismissal. He was beautiful, and I was just the facts. This pattern continued long after college. After my first tour, I came home to Philadelphia and fell in with a small nonprofit working on clean water initiatives. It was there I met Dr. Miriam Sato. She was a force of nature, a hydrologist whose mind moved like a river, deep, powerful, and ever-flowing. Her work was revolutionary, focusing on low-cost, open-source water filtration for vulnerable communities. I helped her with her grant proposals and data modeling. She saw me, truly saw me, not for my resume or my rank, but for my mind. She called me her silent partner, a compliment I cherished. We'd spend hours in her small lab in Manayunk, surrounded by the quiet hum of equipment and the faint, clean scent of distilled water. She had a way of looking at a problem as if she were holding it in her hands, turning it over to see every angle, every flicker of a weakness. Julian, meanwhile, was building his profile, and his company, Hydrian Labs, was the vehicle. He always kept in touch, calling me periodically with questions, asking for insight on Dr. Sato's work. He'd say things like, "You and Dr. Sato are changing the world. I just want to help." I was the bridge between them, connecting his corporate resources with her open-source ideals. I didn't think anything of it. He was our public face, the one with the capital and the connections, and we were the quiet engine. I was just happy that Dr. Sato's work, her legacy, was getting the attention it deserved. He was all smiles and grand gestures, a carefully constructed facade of integrity. He'd bring coffee, talk about my service, and always ask about Miriam's latest research. He came to the lab once, wearing a suit that looked impossibly expensive, a stark contrast to Dr. Sato's worn lab coat. He held a tablet and took copious notes as Miriam explained her new membrane design, a genius simplification that used locally sourced materials. He complimented her endlessly, but his eyes were on the diagrams. I remember he had a question about the patenting process, and she just laughed. "Patents? Why? This is for everyone, not just one company." I didn't know it then, but that statement was a dagger in the dark, a warning sign I didn't recognize. I saw it as her integrity. Julian saw it as an opportunity. The first hint of a fracture, a small crack in the carefully constructed facade, was a seemingly innocent email he sent me. It was a request for Dr. Sato's early research notes, citing compliance reasons. I gave them to him without a second thought, blinded by my own trust. My mistake. My discipline had always been my greatest strength, but it had made me slow to recognize a threat I couldn't categorize. Julian wasn't a public enemy. He was an intimate one. He didn't break down the doors. He walked right through the ones I held open for him. He was the public face, the one who took the credit, the one who always seemed to arrive at the finish line with my hard work tucked neatly in his pocket. I was the silent partner, the soldier in the background, the one who was never meant to be seen. He took my ideas, my mentor's research, and packaged it all as his own. And I let him. Because I had been trained to be invisible, to work in the shadows. He used that against me, weaponized my quiet discipline. I was a ghost in my own life, watching him take credit for my creations, my research, my very existence. The flicker of unease in my gut grew, but I rationalized it away, convincing myself that the important thing was the work, not the credit. But the gut, as I was learning, has its own kind of intelligence. It registers a wrongness that the mind can't yet articulate. And in the quiet hum of my routines, that wrongness was beginning to vibrate. A signal I was not yet ready to decode. The day of the National Water Summit arrived with the heat of a Washington, D.C. summer, the kind of oppressive humidity that settles on you like a heavy coat. The air, thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive hotel lobby, felt charged. It was an industry event, live-streamed to a global audience of policymakers, investors, and engineers. And I was there, not as a speaker or an honoree, but as a ghost. I had a badge that read consultant, a deliberate vagueness that suited my role. I was a witness, an observer. A soldier in a room filled with civilian optics. I found a seat in the back row, a strategic position that gave me a clear view of the stage without placing me in the spotlight. The lights were hot and bright, making the air shimmer. I could hear the constant, low hum of the massive HVAC system, a sound that in my head became a rotor blade, a prelude to a storm. My gaze was fixed on the stage, a tableau of power and influence. Julian Vale was the centerpiece, his face on the jumbotron, larger than life. He was a master of the grand gesture, and today was his magnum opus. His keynote was titled, Inventing Dignity, Hydrian Labs' New Horizon. The arrogance was breathtaking. He was in the middle of a prepared speech, full of the kind of buzzwords that made investors' eyes light up. We are not just selling a product, he was saying, his voice a practiced symphony of confidence. We are delivering a promise. The promise of clean water, of a future where no one is left behind. The audience was captivated. They didn't see the lies tucked neatly between the words. They only saw a benevolent billionaire. Then he saw me. He paused, a flicker of something surprise? Defiance, crossing his face. He quickly recovered, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. And speaking of promises, he said, turning to the audience with a glint in his eye, we have with us today a true hometown hero. Lila Brooks, a former military analyst who traded boardrooms for barracks, proving that you can always go home again. I suppose she collects ribbons like bottle caps, bringing home a new one every time she comes back from a tour. The laughter was instant, a wave of sound that crashed over me. It wasn't a malicious roar, but a polite, privileged chuckle. The kind of laughter that comes from people who believe they are in on a joke where my service, my sacrifice, was the punchline. My face didn't move. My expression remained neutral, a mask I had spent years perfecting. Inside, my heart cadence accelerated, a panicked drumbeat against my ribs. My hands, hidden in the pockets of my borrowed blazer, went cold, the skin feeling tight and foreign. My breath was boxed in Kevlar, a shallow, desperate gasp I couldn't release. Every ounce of my being wanted to flinch, to react, to scream. But I didn't. I had been trained for moments like this. The public theater. The frozen frame. I was a grenade with the pin still intact, a quiet force of total restraint. The cameras, those tiny red lights, were all on him, but I could feel the invisible gaze of the crowd on me. I was a public spectacle, the punchline in Julian's narrative. My mind went blank, a white heat of pure, undiluted rage. But it was a silent rage, one that consumed me without a single outward sign. I saw the faces of the people I had worked with, the ones who had praised my work, the ones who had benefited from it. They looked away, their gazes shifting to the stage, their allegiances clear. The betrayal was complete. Julian, emboldened by the audience's reaction, continued. Hydrian Labs, he said, his voice swelling with false sincerity, is about inventing dignity at scale. It's not about military solutions or antiquated designs. It's about bringing hope to communities through true innovation. He was speaking directly to me now, his eyes meeting mine on the Jumbotron, a silent challenge. He was claiming my mentor's work, my quiet contributions, my very identity, and he was doing it in front of the world. A small part of me, a deeply wounded part, wanted to run. To escape this suffocating spotlight and the humiliation that came with it. I could feel the pressure of the moment, the weight of a public lie settling over me. The low hum of the HVAC, the distant click of a camera shutter, the rustle of a program, every sound felt like an assault. My body was a battleground, a place of internal conflict. I was in the middle of a crowd, but I had never felt more alone. The shame, a bitter frost, crept along my skin, making me shiver in the warm, humid air. I thought of Dr. Sato, her gentle hands and her brilliant mind. I thought of the countless hours we had spent, the late nights poring over data, the quiet joy of discovery. Julian's words were not just an insult to me, they were a desecration of her legacy. He had taken her work, a labor of love and a gift to the world, and reduced it to a commodity. A product to be sold. A trophy to be held. My stillness, my practiced restraint, was the only armor I had left. They could take my name, my reputation, my mentor's work. But they couldn't take my resolve. I pushed myself out of my seat, moving with a calm deliberation that belied the storm raging inside. I didn't rush. I simply stood and walked out of the ballroom, every step a statement of my silent resistance. The laughter followed me, a lingering echo. I walked past the ornate doors, past the velvet ropes, and into the night air. The cool, humid air of DC hit my face like a slap. I could still hear the distant sounds of applause and Julian's voice, a triumph on the wind. The sound of his laughter, the sight of his satisfied face, and the feeling of the heavy, humid air all fused into a lingering image. I found a quiet corner in a small park a few blocks from the museum, the kind with wrought iron benches and the distant, muffled sound of city traffic. The air, heavy with humidity, smelled of rain and exhaust. I sat down, the silence of the night wrapping around me like a blanket. It was a different kind of silence than the one I had cultivated inside the ballroom. This was an active silence, a living thing. A silence that gave me room to breathe. I was no longer an operator in a war zone of optics. I was just a woman with a racing heart and a terrible certainty. The public humiliation was a lie, a performance. The real betrayal was quiet, and it was waiting for me. I pulled out my phone. I didn't need to look for proof. I knew where it was. Years ago, I'd set up a private email account, a kind of digital honeypot. It was a simple trick, one I'd learned in my training, a silent, digital dragnet. I had forwarded every communication from Hadrian's public relations team to this account, a redundant backup just in case. I scrolled through the inbox, the blue light of the screen a stark contrast to the darkness around me. My finger found an old email, a misaddressed vendor invoice, a single, stray data point. I opened it. It was from a supplier in Pittsburgh, billing Hadrian Labs $47,000 for a water filtration unit. The product number matched one of Julian's flagship devices. I cross-referenced the part number with the open-source bill of materials, BM, from Dr. Sato's lab. The two lists were nearly identical. Dr. Sato's BM costed the unit at $480. The world tilted. It wasn't just a lie. It was a con. Julian wasn't a philanthropist. He was a thief, repackaging Dr. Sato's work and selling it for 100 times its value. He had built his empire on a foundation of intellectual theft and public manipulation. He hadn't just taken her work, he had corrupted it, turning her gift to the world into a vehicle for his greed. The shock of it all was a physical blow. A sudden, sharp pain in my chest. I felt the slow, deliberate crawl of frost from my fingertips, up my arms, and across my skin. The initial flicker of doubt I had felt years ago was now a full, public shame, a cold, bitter reality. The silence that followed was a character in its own right. It wasn't empty, it was full of all the things I had lost. The trust one had in Julian, the faith I had in my own judgment, the years I had dedicated to a cause I thought was noble. My life, my very purpose, felt like a hollowed-out vessel. The quiet of the park was a courtroom where I was both the judge and the judged. I had been so disciplined, so focused on the mission, that I had been blind to the man standing right in front of me, taking my life's work. It was a deep, raw, and devastating realization. I sat there for a long time, the city a distant hum, the feeling of betrayal a physical ache. I didn't cry. Crying felt like a luxury I couldn't afford. Instead, I cataloged the loss. I had lost a friend. I had lost a mentor's legacy. I had lost my own peace of mind. And most importantly, I had lost the belief that good work, done quietly, was its own reward. The silence was the sound of my life collapsing. I sat with it, letting the full weight of it settle on me. I didn't resist. I didn't fight. I just let myself be broken. I knew what it felt like to have your world shatter, to feel the very ground you stand on crumble beneath your feet. I had a choice, to stay in the rubble or to start building. Have you ever stood inside this kind of silence, where trust collapses? If you have, you already know what I felt. My private vow was not a cry for vengeance. It was a quiet, firm resolution. I would not let his greed win. I would not let my mentor's legacy be erased. I would not let the world believe his lies. I had been a ghost, a quiet partner, an invisible force. It was time for a new kind of silence. A silence that was a weapon, not a shield. I would not shout. I would not scream. I would simply unmask. The soldier in me, the one who had been trained to observe and wait, began to take command. I got up, a new kind of cold determination in my bones, and walked back to the familiar, low hum of my building, the one with the constant rhythm of a world being washed clean. My silence was a reconnaissance mission. For 2 weeks, I did nothing but watch. I watched Julian's social media, the press releases from Hadrian Labs, and the commentary sections on the news sites that had covered his keynote. The public was on his side, and the story of the benevolent tech CEO was spreading. He had successfully taken Dr. Sato's decades of work, her intellectual legacy, and repurposed it as his own. The flicker of public shame from the gala was now a quiet acceptance, a settled consensus. Everyone believed the lie. I let them. I knew that the truth, when it finally emerged, would hit with the force of a detonated charge. My strategy was simple: facts do the work. My training had taught me that the most powerful form of truth isn't an accusation, it's a contradiction. I was looking for a single, undeniable piece of evidence, a fatal flaw in Julian's narrative that would bring the whole house of cards down. I found it in an unexpected place: a message from Priya Narang. Priya was Hadrian's CTO, a brilliant but quietly ambitious woman with a symbolic trait I had missed before, a rehearsed grace that hid a deep well of professional conscience. I had known her from a few professional mixers, but had never trusted her fully. Her message was short and to the point. I can't keep quiet. The lies are getting too big. We met for coffee in a small, out-of-the-way cafe in a quiet neighborhood in D.C. The air was thick with the scent of coffee and the low murmur of conversation, but my attention was fixed on Priya. She was nervous, her hands trembling as she held her cup, but her eyes were clear. She had been tasked with getting Julian's keynote presentation ready for his next big summit, and in the process, she had stumbled across a fatal flaw. He told me to backdate all the files, she said, her voice a low whisper. The patents, the design specs, everything. He wanted to make it look like our work preceded Dr. Sato's. She handed me a thumb drive. This is a copy of our internal mail server archives. It has everything: the original timestamped emails, the drafts of the patents, the lies. The truth is all there. My heart didn't race. It settled. This wasn't a moment of victory, it was a moment of calibration. The pieces were falling into place. But there was still one more detail I needed. Priya, I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, what was the design quirk Julian claimed was his own? She looked at me, a flash of recognition in her eyes. It's a tiny, engraved notch on the filter housing. A small mark, almost invisible, that indicates the correct field orientation for the unit. He called it a trademark. A lot of people think it's just a branding mark. My mind flashed back to a memory I had long since filed away. A late night in Dr. Sato's lab, a simple lesson on field logistics. She had shown me a prototype of her filter. See this notch, Lila, she had said, her voice soft. It's a safety mark. A little detail to make sure the unit is installed correctly, even in the dark. It was a design quirk. A detail so small, so seemingly insignificant, that no one would ever think to question it. It was the smoking rivet. It was the single, fatal detail that Julian had accidentally kept, a ghost of Dr. Sato's original genius. I had photos of her prototypes from the late 80s, and the notch was there. The bridge between the lie and the truth was in that tiny detail. I took the thumb drive from Priya. I didn't thank her. There was no need for words. We both knew what was happening. This wasn't about gratitude, it was about justice. My silent strategy was working. I didn't need to shout. I didn't need to post. I didn't need to give an interview. The facts were doing the work for me. My moment came at the National Utilities Summit in D.C. a week later. Julian was giving a keynote, his face on the Jumbotron, his voice a polished symphony of self-congratulation. I sat in the back row, my face an unreadable mask. During the Q&A, I simply sent a single, anonymous email to the moderator with a link to a file I had prepared. It was a single, clean page. On one side was a screenshot from Priya's email archive, Julian's instructions to backdate the patents. On the other was a side-by-side CD overlay, my own work, showing the near-perfect match between Dr. Sato's open-source design and Hadrian's patented unit, right down to the tiny, engraved notch. I had also included a photo of Dr. Sato's original 1989 prototype. The Jumbotron flickered, and then, of a technical glitch, it changed. It was no longer Julian's face. It was my page. The crowd went silent. Julian's mouth, frozen in the middle of a prepared answer, went slack. He looked from the screen to the moderator, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. The moment of truth, the face reveal I had waited for, was happening in real time. He was exposed. My presence, my discipline, my quiet observation had led to this moment. They had misread my discipline. They had mistaken my silence for defeat. And in that moment, the balance shifted. The immediate aftermath was a whirlwind of noise I chose not to engage with. The room erupted. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, and the low hum of the crowd turned into a panicked roar. Julian, his face a mask of shock and fury, was led from the stage. But I didn't linger. I walked out of the building with the same calm deliberation I'd used a week earlier. I didn't give a statement, I didn't answer a single call from reporters, and I didn't post a thing on social media. My silence had been a weapon, and now it was a boundary. The war was over, but the work of building a new peace had just begun. My recovery was not a sudden event, but a disciplined, purposeful rebuild. I started by strategically withdrawing from all toxic ties. The first step was simple, almost ritualistic. I got a new phone number. I closed out all my old chat accounts and deleted the email I had used as a honeypot. It was like cutting a frayed rope, severing a connection that had long since become a liability. I didn't need to see Julian's downfall. The world was handling that for me. I didn't need to gloat. A quiet confidence was a far more powerful statement. I deleted the old photos, the ones of Julian and me from college, the ones of us at the early Hydrian pitches. It wasn't about erasing the past, but about unfollowing the war. I was moving forward, and I needed to shed the dead weight. My life, once defined by the anticipation of betrayal, was now structured around routines of resilience. The Schuylkill River in Philadelphia became my new proving ground. I started my mornings with a dawn run, the air cool and crisp, the sun a gentle wash of pink and gold over the water. My body, once a vessel for stress and silent rage, became a tool for disciplined recovery. I did kettlebell circuits in the small, open space of my apartment, my body moving with a strength that felt entirely new. I drank my black coffee not with nervous energy, but with a quiet, focused intention. I wasn't just working out, I was rebuilding. Every muscle I strengthened, every breath I controlled, was a small, deliberate act of reclaiming myself. My Spartan apartment, the one above the laundromat with its constant, reassuring thrum, became a field headquarters for my new life. It was a place of purpose, not just a place to sleep. I spent my days working on a project I called the Open Wells Coalition. It wasn't a company, and it didn't seek profit. It was a formalization of Dr. Sato's original vision, a small alliance of veterans, civil engineers, and tribal water officers. We would use her original open-source designs to bring clean water to communities that had been left behind. The work was slow, painstaking, and deeply rewarding. I wasn't just a ghost in my own life anymore. I was a builder. My chosen alliances were with people who understood quiet competence. Ms. Ortiz, a tribal water officer with warm steel in her eyes, became my field partner. She didn't ask about the past, she only asked what the next step was. Senator Art Delgado, a veteran who understood the value of a quiet soldier, backed our efforts, helping to formalize our nonprofit status. These were not alliances of convenience or charisma. They were built on shared values and mutual respect. We were all working for a cause, not for a profile. We moved with quiet purpose, our work a silent rebuke to Julian's grand, empty gestures. The frost of betrayal, the bitter shame that had once defined my emotional landscape, began to thaw. It was replaced by a sense of calm. The ash of the old world, the one that Julian had tried to burn down, was a fertile ground for new growth. I no longer had to put on a mask of neutrality. My face, my posture, my eyes, all held a new kind of peace. My shoulders were unbowed, my gaze was level, and my smile, though still small and private, was decided. It was not a smile of triumph, but a smile of quiet liberation. My voice, once a tool for silent observation, was now the verdict. It was low, steady, and filled with a new kind of authority. I no longer needed to perform. I just needed to be. The world had its own rhythm of justice, and it was playing out without my intervention. The aftermath of the DC summit was a slow, deliberate unraveling. Hydrian Labs was forced into a consent decree, a quiet but damning admission of guilt. Their stock, once a glittering symbol of success, collapsed under the weight of the scandal. The board, in a swift and public move, removed Julian, a final, unceremonious ending to his reign. The patents, once so proudly displayed, were quietly recategorized as derivative of Dr. Sato's original work. I didn't have to file a lawsuit or demand restitution. The universe was taking care of it. There was no public gloating, no victory lap. Just a sense of quiet liberation of a wrong finally righted. The lasting echo of it all wasn't in the headlines or the courtrooms, but in the peaceful, everyday scene that unfolded miles away. It was a crisp, clear day in the Navajo Nation, the kind of day where the air feels impossibly clean and the sky stretches on forever. I was standing in front of a small elementary school, the sounds of children's laughter a happy soundtrack to my life. We had just finished installing one of our first Open Wells Coalition units. It was a simple, elegant piece of equipment, a perfect copy of Dr. Sato's original design, down to the tiny, engraved notch on the housing. The children gathered around the new tap, their faces lit up with a mix of wonder and excitement. One by one, they filled their bottles, the sound of the running water a quiet triumph. My work wasn't about patents or profits anymore. It was about clean water and open access. It was about a legacy that was being honored, not stolen. We had put up a small plaque beside the tap, a simple tribute. It read, "In honor of Dr. Miriam Sato, 1989, water belongs to everyone." I reached into my pocket and touched the bent brass whistle on my keychain. It was no longer a symbol of betrayal or a reminder of a warning I had missed. It was a symbol of peace, a reminder to always lead without a shout. I had come full circle. The public humiliation that had started it all was now a distant memory. The woman who had been a ghost in her own life was now a quiet force for good, a builder, an ally. The ash of my old life had nourished a new one. The quiet dignity I had held onto was now a way of life. The greatest revenge I had discovered wasn't a lawsuit or a public confrontation. It was living well. It was proving them wrong not with words, but with a life of purpose and peace. I had accepted what was stolen, and in that acceptance, I had found a new kind of strength. The kind of strength that is born from a quiet refusal to let bitterness win. I had been told that some battles are won when you refuse to fight. But I had found something even more powerful. Some battles are won when you refuse to fire. When you let the truth be the only weapon you need. I was no longer a soldier on a battlefield. I was a gardener, tending to a new world. Have you found your way back from betrayal? If you've ever walked through something like this, tell me your story in the comments. I read them all, and someone out there needs to hear what you've survived. And if you want more stories that remind you you're not alone, stay here with me for the next one.